Well, David, again, thanks for the opportunity to conduct this interview. I'm a huge fan of Darksiders franchise, Vigil Games, and now Gunfire. So I really appreciate again the opportunity to get together.
Yeah, no problem.
It's kind of a hot rumor, I guess, for a few years about the crawler project you guys are working on as part of Crytek. Could you kind of tell us a little bit more about what that was and if it's still something in the works right now?
Sure. It was actually a project at THQ, and it was like we started it after we finished Darksiders 2, and it initially started as like another Darksiders game, Darksiders 3, which was gonna feature Strife. I'll let you not tell you that much, but they kind of said, hey, why don't you take a break from Darksiders and do something different? So we're like, all right, that's cool, and we kind of had this idea of we wanted to do sort of a procedural generated world game, not completely procedural generated like Minecraft, but have you ever played like Terraria? It was inspired by Terraria, so we just wanted a cool game where like you kind of explored this random world and awesome stuff happened, like you'd run into bosses, or you'd make levitation boots, or you'd make a weird hook shot and be able to make a lot of cool gear items. So it had a lot of the like DNA of a Darksiders game, so there's going to be like traversal and all kinds of crazy wacky contraptions and stuff like that, but it was kind of set in like a fantasy version of the 1800s. And you were just in this giant city. And then it was called Crawler for Dungeon Crawler because the game was kind of like one giant dungeon. But the basic loop was sort of like you'd go out, you'd find stuff, you'd make new items, you might make double jump boots, or you might make a hook shot, or you might make like a weird balloon that lets you float from building top to building top. And the whole while sort of exploring further and further out from the center of the town. You'd go under the town, you'd go out in the wilderness outside of the town and find cool bosses and run into cool quests and sort of that sort of thing. So we worked on it for, man, I actually don't remember how long we worked on it, but we had a functioning prototype. I remember that much. And, I remember showing it at THQ and everybody was like super impressed. They were like, wow, this is really cool. So we were mega excited about that game. And it had the same kind of like cool fantasy creatures like Darksiders. It wasn't like quite the same world, but they were very Darksiders-esque creatures. So you could imagine a more 1800s take like werewolves and that sort of stuff.
Awesome. Is that something you guys think you might come back to at some point in the near future?
I mean, I would love to. I love the 1800s. It's not a coincidence that we went to Crytek. We made an Old West like cowboy game also in the 1800s. It wasn't like werewolves and vampires and stuff like the Crawler game was, but I just personally love that time period, and I love the idea of like mixing the Old West with fantasy. There was an old pen and paper role-playing game called Deadlands. I guess it's not old, it's still around. I haven't played it in a while, so it's old to me. But it was always a really cool concept because it was like, hey, here's the 1800s, but it's got all these cool fantasy elements, and like card trick guys are actually magicians, and I just love that cool combination of fantasy and real world stuff, which is kind of what we did with Darksiders. Darksiders was like, hey, what if you put fantasy in a modern era? It's a similar concept. It's like, hey, let's put fantasy in the 1800s.